You don't drink alcohol. You're not overweight enough to worry. And your liver tests came back almost normal. But inside your body, fat is slowly building up in your liver. This is fatty liver, and most people discover it completely by accident. And here's the dangerous part. You can have fatty liver for years without a single symptom. Not a sign, not a warning, nothing. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how it starts, how it silently progresses, and most importantly, whether it can still be reversed. Most people, when they hear the words fatty liver, immediately think of alcohol. That association is so automatic, so deeply wired into public understanding, that the moment a doctor delivers the diagnosis, the first response from a patient who doesn't drink is almost always the same. Are you sure? There must be a mistake. I don't drink. But the doctor is not mistaken. And that assumption, that fatty liver belongs only to heavy drinkers, is quietly allowing one of the most common and reversible metabolic conditions in the world to go unaddressed in people who have no idea it is happening inside them. Fatty liver is one of the most misunderstood conditions in modern medicine. Ask most people what causes it, and they will tell you the same thing: drinking too much alcohol. That association is so deeply embedded in public consciousness that millions of people with fatty liver dismiss the diagnosis entirely. They don't drink, they don't have a problem. But the problem is very much there, and it is growing. The full name of the condition is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The word non-alcoholic is right there in the title, and yet it rarely registers the way it should. What it means is simple. This disease develops completely independent of alcohol consumption. You can drink every single day and never develop it. You can never touch a drop of alcohol in your life and develop it anyway. Alcohol is one pathway to liver damage, but it is a separate pathway entirely. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease follows a different road, driven by different forces, and those forces have nothing to do with what is in your glass. Now here is where it gets interesting, and a little uncomfortable. What those forces have everything to do with is how your body processes energy. At its core, fatty liver is a disease of metabolism. It is what happens when the systems your body uses to manage sugar, fat, and insulin begin to break down. When those systems are working correctly, your liver plays a central and elegant role. It receives nutrients from digestion, processes them, stores what the body needs later, and releases energy when it is called upon. The liver is not passive. It is one of the most metabolically active organs in the entire body, performing hundreds of functions simultaneously, around the clock, without rest. But when the metabolic environment around it becomes disordered, and the liver is one of the first places that disorder becomes visible. The reason for this comes down to the liver's unique position in the body's architecture. Everything absorbed through your digestive system passes through the liver first, before it reaches general circulation. That means the liver is the first organ to receive the full impact of what you eat, how much insulin is circulating in your blood, and how well your cells are responding to that insulin. When those inputs are healthy and balanced, the liver manages them effortlessly. When they are chronically imbalanced, when blood sugar is persistently elevated, when insulin levels are chronically high, when cells have become resistant to insulin signals, the liver begins to struggle under the load it was never designed to carry indefinitely. And this is the part that changes everything about how you should think about this condition. The fat that accumulates in liver cells is not arriving there randomly. It is being produced there, manufactured by the liver itself in response to metabolic signals that have gone wrong upstream. The liver is not malfunctioning on its own terms. It is responding in the only way it knows how to an internal environment that has become disordered. It is the downstream consequence of a metabolic system under stress. Treating fatty liver without addressing that underlying metabolic dysfunction is like mopping the floor without turning off the tap. The source of the problem remains, and the problem returns. But here is what most people never get told after their diagnosis. This distinction matters enormously because it changes everything about how fatty liver should be approached, understood, and reversed. If it were simply a liver disease, the solution would be to treat the liver directly, with medication, with supplements, with targeted interventions aimed at the organ itself. But the most powerful and evidence-backed interventions for fatty liver are not liver-specific at all. They are metabolic. Weight loss, insulin control, dietary changes, physical activity, sleep quality. These are the tools that work because they address the actual source of the dysfunction rather than its most visible symptom. Understanding fatty liver as a metabolic disease also means understanding that it does not exist in isolation. It sits within a cluster of interconnected conditions: insulin resistance, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic inflammation, that share the same metabolic roots. Fatty liver is rarely a standalone finding. It is a signal that the broader metabolic system is under stress and that other conditions may be developing alongside it, or may follow if nothing changes. And that signal, that early, actionable, still reversible signal, is the most important thing a fatty liver diagnosis can give you. The most important thing a person can take from a fatty liver diagnosis is not fear, it is clarity. The liver is not failing arbitrarily. The body is not broken beyond repair. What is happening is a metabolic process that has causes, that has stages, and that, when caught early enough, has a genuine path back to health. But that path begins with understanding what fatty liver actually is, where it actually comes from, and why blaming alcohol, or dismissing the diagnosis entirely, is the most costly mistake a person can make. If someone told you that the condition damaging your liver right now had nothing to do with your liver, that it started somewhere else entirely, years before any scan could detect a problem, most people would not believe it. But that is exactly what the evidence shows. Fatty liver does not begin in the liver. It begins in a process so common, so widespread, and so silent that an estimated 1 in 3 adults is living with it right now without knowing. It begins with insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is one of those terms that gets mentioned frequently and understood rarely. Most people have heard it. Far fewer people know what it actually means inside the body, how it develops, and why it sits at the center of so many modern diseases. When it comes to fatty liver, then insulin resistance is not a contributing factor or a risk element. It is the origin point. It is where the story begins, long before the liver shows any sign of trouble, long before any scan or blood test reveals anything unusual, long before a person has any reason to suspect that something has quietly gone wrong. To understand why insulin resistance leads to fatty liver, you first have to understand what insulin is actually doing in a healthy body. Insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas, released every time blood sugar rises, which happens after every meal. Its job is to act as a key, unlocking the doors of your cells so that glucose can enter and be used for energy. When insulin is working correctly, this process is efficient and self-regulating. Blood sugar rises, insulin is released, glucose enters the cells, the blood sugar returns to normal, and insulin levels fall. The whole cycle completes cleanly, and the body moves on. Now here is where the system begins to break, and where most people's understanding stops. Insulin resistance is what happens when that key stops working properly. The cells, particularly in the muscles, fat tissue, and liver, begin to lose their sensitivity to insulin's signal. The doors don't open as easily as they once did. Glucose cannot enter the cells as efficiently, so it remains in the bloodstream for longer than it should. The body detects the elevated blood sugar and responds the only way it knows how, by producing more insulin, sending more keys, trying to force the locks open. For a while, this compensation works. The pancreas produces enough extra insulin to keep blood sugar in a relatively normal range. On the surface, nothing looks wrong, but underneath, The system is under enormous and sustained pressure, and what happens next is the part that directly creates fatty liver, and almost nobody talks about it. This compensatory state, high insulin, cells that are increasingly resistant to it, blood sugar that is being kept in check only through sheer hormonal force, is where the damage to the liver begins. Because chronically elevated insulin does not just affect blood sugar regulation, it sends signals throughout the entire body, and one of the loudest signals it sends is a directive to store fat. High insulin is a fat storage signal. It tells the body that energy is abundant, that fuel is available, and that excess should be saved rather than burned. Under these conditions, fat breakdown slows dramatically, and fat accumulation accelerates. The liver receives this signal directly and powerfully. Because of its unique position in the body, receiving everything absorbed from digestion before it reaches general circulation, the liver is exposed to the highest concentrations of insulin of any organ. When insulin is chronically elevated due to resistance, the liver is essentially bathed in a continuous fat storage signal, hour after hour, day after day. And it responds accordingly. It begins producing fat from the excess glucose arriving through the portal vein, through a process called de novo lipogenesis, the creation of new fat from scratch. Here is the part that should make you pause for a moment. De novo lipogenesis is not a malfunction. It is a normal metabolic process that exists for good reason. The liver's ability to convert excess carbohydrates into fat for storage was once a survival advantage, allowing the body to bank energy during periods of abundance for use during scarcity. But the human body evolved in an environment of intermittent plenty, not chronic excess. When de novo lipogenesis is triggered occasionally and modestly, the liver handles it without difficulty. When it is triggered continuously in large volumes by a metabolic environment defined by insulin resistance and chronically elevated blood sugar, the liver begins producing fat faster than it can export or burn it. And that fat has nowhere to go except to accumulate inside the liver cells themselves. This is the precise moment when fatty liver begins, not with a sudden event, not with a dramatic shift, but with a slow and invisible accumulation driven by a metabolic process that has been quietly running out of balance for months or years. The person feels nothing. The liver shows nothing on routine tests. Life continues as normal on the outside, while inside fat is building up cell by cell, the liver is gradually enlarging, and the conditions for the next stage of the disease are being set in place without a single warning signal reaching the surface. And here is the most important thing to take from all of this. What makes this so significant is that insulin resistance itself is largely invisible in its early stages. It develops gradually, driven by a combination of dietary patterns, physical inactivity, poor sleep, chronic stress, and genetic predisposition. It can be present and progressing for years before blood sugar rises enough to trigger a prediabetes diagnosis, and years more before type 2 diabetes develops. All the while, the liver is absorbing the consequences. All the while, fat is accumulating. And all the while, the window for reversal, which is wide open in the early stages, is slowly beginning to narrow. Most people who have fatty liver do not know they have it. Not because they haven't seen a doctor, not because they haven't had blood tests, but because fatty liver, in its early and most treatable stages, produces no symptoms whatsoever. And the standard tests that doctors routinely run are not sensitive enough to catch it before the damage has already been accumulating for years. This is not a rare edge case. This is the experience of the overwhelming majority of people living with this condition right now. They feel well. Their tests look acceptable. And inside their liver, fat is quietly building up, stage by stage, in complete silence. Fatty liver moves through 4 distinct stages. And understanding those stages is not just medically useful. It is the difference between catching this condition when it can be fully reversed and discovering it when the options have already narrowed. Each stage represents a different level of damage, a different degree of urgency, and a completely different set of possibilities for what comes next. And the most important thing to understand from the outset is that the stage you are in right now is almost certainly not the stage you imagine it to be. Stage 1 is called simple steatosis. It is the point at which fat has begun to accumulate inside the liver cells, but the liver itself has not yet mounted an inflammatory response. The organ is functioning. There is no scarring. There is no active damage in the way that medical professionals would define cellular injury. From the outside, and even from most standard blood panels, everything looks unremarkable. Liver enzyme levels, the ALT and AST values that doctors use as primary indicators of liver health, can sit comfortably within the normal range even when significant fat accumulation is already present inside the cells. A person in stage 1 has no symptoms, no discomfort, no fatigue that they would connect to their liver, and no blood test result waving a red flag. And here is the part that stops most people when they hear it for the first time. The absence of symptoms in stage 1 is not reassurance. It is a characteristic of the disease itself. Fatty liver was never designed by nature to hurt early. The liver has no pain receptors of its own, which means it can sustain damage for years without generating a single signal that reaches conscious awareness. And the silence is not safety. It is the disease doing exactly what it does in its early stages, which is accumulate, expand, and wait for the metabolic conditions that caused it to continue providing the fuel it needs to progress. Stage 2 is where the condition shifts from a storage problem into something more serious. This stage is called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and what changes at this point is the presence of inflammation. The fat that has built up inside the liver cells begins to trigger an immune response. The liver recognizes cellular stress and sends inflammatory signals in an attempt to manage it. This inflammation is the body trying to protect itself, but the protection comes at a cost. Inflamed liver cells are damaged liver cells, and damaged liver cells are the foundation on which the next stage of the disease is built. A person in stage 2 may still feel nothing. Their blood tests may still return results that a doctor describes as slightly elevated but not alarming, and yet the process has moved from passive accumulation to active injury. Now here is where the progression becomes genuinely dangerous, and where most people still have no idea anything is wrong. Stage 3 is fibrosis. When the liver sustains repeated or sustained inflammatory damage, the body responds by attempting to repair it. That repair process involves the laying down of fibrous scar tissue, tough, rigid material that replaces the flexible, functional liver cells that were lost to inflammation. In moderate fibrosis, the liver continues to function adequately. It compensates. It adapts. But the scar tissue does not perform the metabolic work that liver cells do. It simply fills the space they once occupied. Each additional round of inflammation adds another layer of fibrosis, and each layer represents a permanent reduction in the liver's functional reserve. What was reversible in stage 1 and stage 2 becomes progressively less so as fibrosis advances, because scar tissue, unlike liver cells, does not regenerate. Stage 4 is cirrhosis, and it is the end point of the fibrotic process taken to its conclusion. At this stage, the liver's architecture has been so extensively replaced by scar tissue that its core functions are compromised in ways that can no longer be compensated for. Fluid begins to accumulate in the abdomen. The liver's ability to filter toxins from the blood deteriorates. The risk of liver cancer rises significantly, and the possibility of reversal, which existed clearly and genuinely in stages 1 and 2 and partially in early stage 3, is gone. Management becomes the goal. Transplantation becomes the conversation. But here is the truth that puts all 4 stages in the perspective that actually matters. The vast majority of people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease are in stage 1 or stage 2. Research consistently shows this. The condition is extraordinarily common, affecting an estimated quarter of the global adult population, and the overwhelming majority of those people have not progressed beyond the point where meaningful reversal is possible. They are living with a condition that is real, that is progressing on its own quiet timeline, and that has not yet crossed the threshold into irreversibility. That is not a reason for complacency. It is a reason for informed, timely action. And this is the piece of the story that changes how you should feel about everything else in this series. The staging of fatty liver is not a measure of how bad things have become. It is a map of where the opportunities still exist. Stage 1 is wide open. Stage 2 is still very much within reach. Early stage 3, with the right interventions, can be stabilized and in some cases, partially reversed. The window does not close overnight. It closes gradually, over years, driven by the same metabolic dysfunction that opened it. Which means every intervention that addresses insulin resistance, reduces liver fat, and brings the metabolic environment back toward balance is not just treating a condition. It is buying back time, reclaiming ground, and moving the needle away from the stages where options disappear and toward the stages where the liver can still do what it has always been capable of doing, given the right conditions to do it. Here is something the medical system does not say loudly enough. Fatty liver, in the majority of people who have it, can be reversed. Not managed, not slowed, reversed. The liver is one of the very few organs in the human body with a genuine capacity to regenerate, and when the conditions that cause the damage are removed and replaced with conditions that support recovery, the liver responds. The fat clears, the inflammation settles, the function returns. But only if the right things are done, consistently, and with an understanding of why they work. The most important thing to understand about fatty liver is that for the majority of people who have it, the story is not over. It has not progressed beyond the point of return. The damage is real, but it is not permanent. And the evidence behind reversal is not anecdotal or hopeful speculation. It is grounded in consistent, reproducible research that points to the same conclusion again and again. The first and most consistently supported intervention in the research is weight loss. Not dramatic, extreme, or surgical weight loss, but a reduction of just 7 to 10% of total body weight. That number is smaller than most people expect, and that is precisely the point. A person weighing 80 kilograms needs to lose somewhere between 5 and 6 kilograms to begin triggering measurable reductions in liver fat. Studies using imaging technology have shown that this level of weight loss produces significant and, in many cases, complete clearance of fat from liver cells, particularly in people who are in stage 1 or stage 2 of the disease. Now, here is what most people get wrong about exercise and fatty liver. The second pillar is movement. And the research here is striking because it shows that exercise reduces liver fat through mechanisms that operate independently of diet and weight loss alone. Resistance training, the kind that builds and maintains muscle, is particularly powerful because muscle tissue is one of the primary sites of glucose uptake in the body. More muscle means more capacity to absorb blood sugar, which means less glucose arriving at the liver to be converted into fat. Walking, done consistently and at a pace that elevates the heart rate moderately, adds to this effect by improving insulin sensitivity across the whole body. Together, the resistance training and regular walking create a metabolic environment in which the liver is under significantly less pressure than before. And in that environment, it begins to clear the fat it has stored. The third pillar is reducing refined carbohydrates and sugary drinks, and the reason this matters so specifically comes back to how the liver processes different types of fuel. Fructose, the sugar found in sweetened beverages, processed foods, and many fruit juices, is metabolized almost exclusively by the liver. Unlike glucose, which can be taken up by muscles and other tissues throughout the body, fructose arrives at the liver and the liver alone bears the burden of processing it. When fructose intake is high and chronic, the liver is continuously overwhelmed and de novo lipogenesis runs at elevated levels without interruption. Reducing refined carbohydrates and eliminating or dramatically cutting sugary drinks removes one of the most direct drivers of liver fat production. And then there is the pillar that almost every conversation about fatty liver leaves out entirely. The fourth pillar is sleep, and it is the one most consistently underestimated. Poor sleep raises cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, and elevated cortisol drives insulin resistance directly. It disrupts the hormonal signals that regulate appetite, leading to increased consumption of high-calorie foods the following day. It reduces the body's ability to manage blood sugar effectively overnight, and it impairs the liver's own regenerative processes, which are most active during deep sleep. Addressing sleep is not optional when it comes to reversing fatty liver. It is load-bearing. And treating it as secondary to diet and exercise means leaving one of the most powerful levers unpulled. The fifth pillar is insulin control, and it is the one that ties all the others together, because every other intervention on this list works in large part by bringing insulin levels down. Lower insulin means fewer fat storage signals reaching the liver. It means de novo lipogenesis slows. It means the liver can begin exporting and oxidizing the fat already stored in its cells rather than continuously adding to it. Weight loss lowers insulin. Exercise lowers insulin. Reducing refined carbohydrates lowers insulin. Better sleep lowers insulin. And that is not a coincidence. That is the mechanism. Each pillar reinforces the others. And at the center of all of them is the same fundamental shift, restoring the body's sensitivity to insulin so that the liver is no longer trapped in a chronic fat storage state and can finally begin the process of clearing, healing, and returning to the function it was always capable of. Most people, when they receive a fatty liver diagnosis, do one of two things. They either panic, convinced something catastrophic is happening inside them, or they dismiss it entirely, reassured by the fact that they feel completely fine. Both responses miss the point, because fatty liver is neither a death sentence nor a harmless, incidental finding. It is a warning, specific, metabolic, and timed. And what you do with that warning determines everything that comes next. Fatty liver does not announce itself. It does not arrive with pain or fatigue or any signal dramatic enough to force a person's attention. It develops quietly, progresses silently, and for years asks nothing of the person carrying it except to continue the habits that allowed it to take hold in the first place. And that silence is precisely what makes ignoring it so costly, because while the person feels nothing, the disease is moving, and the direction it moves in without intervention is not neutral. The first of those consequences is type 2 diabetes, and this connection is not coincidental. It is mechanistic. Both conditions share the same root in insulin resistance, and fatty liver is in many ways insulin resistance made visible in the liver. As insulin resistance deepens and the pancreas works harder and harder to compensate, it eventually reaches a point where it can no longer produce enough insulin to keep blood sugar in a safe range. That is the moment type 2 diabetes is diagnosed. Here is what that means in practical terms, and why it matters more than most people realize. People with fatty liver are significantly more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than those without it, not because one causes the other in a simple linear sense, but because both are expressions of the same underlying metabolic dysfunction advancing along its natural course. Allowing fatty liver to progress unchecked is, in many cases, allowing the metabolic environment that produces type 2 diabetes to deepen and entrench itself further with every passing month. The second consequence is cardiovascular disease, and this is where the stakes become most urgent. Heart disease and stroke remain the leading causes of death globally, and the metabolic syndrome that drives fatty liver, insulin resistance, elevated triglycerides, chronic inflammation, disturbed blood lipid profiles, is the same cluster of conditions that damages blood vessels. It accelerates arterial plaque formation and raises the risk of cardiac events. People with fatty liver face a significantly elevated risk of cardiovascular disease, and that risk exists independently of other traditional risk factors. And then, there is the third consequence, the one that is hardest to reverse and easiest to prevent. The progression of liver disease itself, from the reversible early stages through fibrosis and into cirrhosis, represents the most direct and irreversible consequence of ignored fatty liver. Fibrosis is the body's attempt to repair liver damage by laying down scar tissue, and while the liver can function through moderate fibrosis, each additional layer of scarring reduces the organ's capacity and resilience. And cirrhosis represents the endpoint of that scarring process, a liver so extensively replaced by scar tissue that it can no longer perform its essential functions adequately. At this stage, the risk of liver failure becomes real, and liver failure cannot be medicated or reversed. But here is what all of this actually means for the person reading it right now. With all of this laid out plainly, the framing that matters most is not one of fear. Fear is a poor motivator for sustained change. What fatty liver actually represents, particularly when it is caught in its early stages, is a remarkably clear and actionable warning. The body has revealed through imaging or blood work or clinical examination that the metabolic system is under stress, and it has done so at a point when that stress can still be addressed, that when the liver can still heal, and when the trajectory toward diabetes, heart disease, and cirrhosis can still be redirected. The people who treat it as an opportunity, who respond to the signal with understanding rather than denial, with consistent action rather than panic, are the ones who reverse it, and in doing so, reduce their risk not just of liver disease, but of the entire cluster of conditions that were quietly forming around it.